Well, that's our town, and I am proud of it. This is my tribute to it. We grew up together. It has changed in half a century, so have I. Psychiatry has changed Topeka, and perhaps Topeka has helped to change psychiatry. Sometimes when I have just returned from the mountains or the seashore, friends who meet me on the street explain sympathetically but enviously about my trip. Were you not sorry to leave, they say. Isn't it hard to come back from such beautiful places into the drab monotony of our Kansas scenery? When they say such things, I cannot answer them. I cannot even look at them for fear of betraying my thoughts. I look at the ground or I look past them to the horizon. Inwardly, I recall the words of a famous Kansan who wrote to his wife on December 10th, 1854. Our food is mush, molasses and bacon, mixed plentifully with dirt 3 times a day. Thus we live in Kansas, a more lovely country I certainly never saw. And yet it looks worse now than at any other season. I am told by those who know that in the spring and early summer, when the grass and shrubbery and flowers appear, it is beautiful beyond conception. So I think it must be. And in a few years, when civilization, by its magic influence, shall have transformed this glorious country from what it is now to the brilliant destiny awaiting it, the sun, in all his course, will visit no land more truly lovely and desirable than this. From the letters of Cyrus Kurtz Holiday, 1854, published in the Historical Quarterly of Kansas in 1937. This man was one of the truly great Kansans because he had a vision not only for the future, but for the present realities. He had come to Kansas from one of the most beautiful states in the Union, Pennsylvania. I am well aware that the other side of the road looks smoother and the grass in the opposite field greener. But I believe this inability of some Kansans to appreciate their own state has a far deeper psychological origin. It is observable in so many different ways. I have sometimes called it, in our professional jargon, a characteristic feeling of inferiority. We seem to share it with Arkansas, which is also a beautiful and creditable state, but whose citizens are often ashamed of having originated there. I see the self-deprecation of Kansans exhibiting itself in the form of a sense of uneasiness, an apologetic manner when in the association of representatives of older and wealthier states, and in a tendency to join with them in a bantering ridicule of our state instead of recognizing how much this represents a defense of their own ignorant provincialism. But more serious, I think, is a kind of asceticism, a willingness to accept as our fate a lot far less comfortable and joyous existence than could be ours almost for the asking. This too springs from our self-deprecation. No one could ask for a better illustration of this than the prohibition sentiment of the state. And this was in the, I know, as everyone else knows, that there are relatively few total abstainers in Kansas. But to keep up appearances, we must not buy or sell liquor publicly. We must smuggle it in from the eastern neighbors. We comfort ourselves with the logic that because some men are fools, others must be martyrs. And because some are martyrs, others must go along with them. The fact that there may be joy in wine is forgotten in the face of the fact that there may be tears in rum. Kansans have no sense of superiority about their prohibition. Some console themselves in a puritanical sense of self-righteousness. But it is cold comfort, for the same energies that have prohibited the open sale of liquor would have gone much farther had they been invested in the promotion of beauty, the improvement of highways, the enlargement of parks, the fostering of music and art. Not but what we have done fairly well with music and art. I am proud of what we have done, but I am afraid that most of my fellow Kansans are not. They are not proud of it because they realize that it is so much less than we could have done had we not had an ascetic disapproval of joy or anything that would make it appear that we were a happy, progressive, successful state. We want to be bleeding Kansas. When someone calls us a typical prairie state, we get angry, not because we think we have been misunderstood, but because we fear we have been understood too well and our shame publicly exposed. I would be happy to believe that our feelings of inferiority are only the expression of an innate modesty, a feeling of revulsion against the flamboyant, bombastic egotism of California and the similar arrogance of a few other states. Unfortunately, I cannot believe this. Kansas does not refrain from announcing that it has the best of this or the best of that because of our essential good taste. Kansas does not announce it because Kansas does not believe it. When I tell friends that I think our scenery is beautiful and that our climate is delightful, Cyrus Holiday said that it was better than that of any sunny Italy. My friends think I am ironic or being a little touched. They would much rather read in the paper that we had broken a heat record so that they could use it to prove their martyrdom than to reflect that hot weather is the healthiest weather of all, and that fewer people die from the effects of climate in Kansas than in almost any other state. Yesterday was 97 in Los Angeles. It was 70 in Topeka. But I am sure this fact was not headlined by any Kansas newspapers, and I am more certain that it is not headlined by any California papers. Last week, New England was ravaged by a terrific windstorm which did more damage in 1 hour than all the tornadoes have done in Kansas since the dawn of civilized history. But I am sure this was not noted by any Kansas newspapers, nor by any of the eastern newspapers which still play up Kansas cyclones. Not long ago, the son of a colleague came to me for advice in regard to entering my alma mater, the Harvard Medical School. He was afraid that he would not be admitted. I remarked that the fact that he was a Kansan would probably be to his advantage in consideration by the committee. Well, he exclaimed, that would be the first time that coming from Kansas ever did me any good. I could not think of any reply to this. He was a handsome young fellow, a member of a third generation since the pioneers. His family has prospered in Kansas, and he was as nattily dressed, as sophisticated in manner as the boys I have known from Harvard and Hopkins and Pennsylvania. But the poor fellow does not know it. He labors under a sense of inferiority, which is pitiful. He goes to college with a sensitiveness which will probably make him either a recluse or a noisy eccentric. I am fairly familiar with physicians across America, and I can honestly say that I believe that we have within the confines of our state medical men quite as capable as those in most other comparable localities. Ambitiously, we endeavor to maintain a medical school, but we do not trust it to be staffed by Kansas doctors. The students of the medical school of the University of Kansas are instructed by men borrowed from Missouri, and Missouri borrows doctors from Kansas City. The phenomenon of the city of Kansas City, Missouri, is perhaps the most brilliant illustration of my thesis. Poor Kansas City is an orphan town. It has no parent state. Missouri disowns it as a metropolis. St. Louis is the Missouri city, and Kansas City should be the Kansas City. But it isn't. Rather, it is and it isn't. It is located largely in Missouri, populated largely by ex-Kansans, depends upon Kansas for its economic existence, supplies Kansas with traveling salesmen, truck drivers, and racketeers, instructs Kansans how to vote, and considers Kansas its great backyard. Kansans, nonetheless, think it is a great metropolis and speak of it reverently as the city. Think of a state smart enough to issue a magazine like this one. Think of a state with people wise enough to abolish capital punishment 50 years ago. Think of a state with people in it capable of erecting a structure like the Santa Fe Railroad or an organization like the Kappa Press. Think of a state with a historical society such as ours. We have heard a lot about wheat, but consider the trees. We are the only state in the Union without a national forest, and yet we are the only state in the Union with more trees in it than at the time it was settled. Think of a state with people in it like William Allen White and Ed Howe, Nelson, Antrim Crawford, William Herbert Caruth, and Esther Clark, John James Ingalls, Charles M. Sheldon, Kirk Matcham, and W.G. Clugston, Berger Sanson, and many others. This is not a state of mediocrities. The same humility of spirit is to be observed in the Kansas intellectuals, in the Kansas voters, and in the Kansas press, in their eagerness to be broad-minded, tolerant, democratic. They have listened receptively to many prophets, some false, some true, and have followed them fervently. This fervent response, a response sometimes bordering on fanaticism, is regarded by many Easterners as characteristic of the people of Kansas. Its abolition, prohibition, populism, anti-tobacco legislation, Brinkley worship, Winrodism. They have gone off the deep end and with desperate seriousness, and in so doing earned for themselves the name of being a humorless, puritanical people, incapable of joy and grudging in their attitude toward those happier than themselves. This is not a pretty reputation, and naturally one shrinks from accepting this description of oneself and his friends and neighbors. Oddly enough, however, we do accept it almost unanimously and meekly endure the opprobrium and ridicule of other states. This, I believe, is due to a humility and self-distrust so great as to be crippling to our energies. For the fanaticism of Kansans is due, I believe, not so much to puritanical self-righteousness, the desire to reform and inhibit, as to a wish to identify themselves with the best, the most idealistic and fruitful ways of life. And because they feel pathetically unequal to maintaining these ideals and to living at the high pitch at which they conceive other more gifted people to be living, they fence themselves about and reinforce their tense strivings with laws and prohibitions. In discussing Kansans, it is usually assumed that their strictness is aimed at coercing other people to their beliefs, to reform the wicked. The reformer's psychology is often described as being a desire to keep others from the sinful pleasures he secretly indulges in, or at least burns to indulge in. This unsympathetic portrayal of the reformer as a hypocrite and a dog in the manger has some truth in it. But this very intolerance of the intolerant betrays an unconscious hypocrisy in the hypocrite hater. To put away the temptation to indulge in more paradoxical but perhaps confusing expressions, let us state it more plainly by saying that at heart everyone is a reformer in the sense that he must curb certain antisocial tendencies in himself, which he openly deprecates but yearns to indulge. We say that his attitudes are unconscious because he is not aware of such yearnings and would probably develop all kinds of defensive symptoms if he began to be aware of the strength of unlawful desires in himself. The activities of the zealot who rushes about making life miserable for other people may be considered as one form of defensive symptom of this type. His activity, therefore, is chiefly directed against himself, in spite of its apparent direction toward the world in general. The world may avoid him, trip him up, laugh at him, and find many ways of overcoming the discomfort he causes. But he has no way of circumventing his own unrelenting harshness toward himself, which drives him to take desperate measures to reinforce his failing defense against antisocial urges. I began by saying that we live in a beautiful state, the state settled by brave, intelligent, and far-visioned people. Then I had to add that our intelligence and our vision do not seem to have prevented us from developing a vast inferiority. Not a real inferiority, but a feeling of inferiority. I related this inferiority to feelings of over-conscientiousness, which in turn, I think, may be an echo of the pioneer struggles of our immediate ancestors. We need writers and artists to proclaim the beauty of Kansas and to demonstrate the intelligence of the majority and not the eccentricity of the lunatic fringe. The members of the press have a special responsibility in this matter. I have long felt that the newspapers could modify the unfavorable opinions of the outsiders if they would modify the feelings of the Kansans about themselves. For the men of the press reflect this attitude of inferiority. Indeed, they encourage it. They exploit it. They like to brag about breaking heat records and raising freaks. They feel a little shamefaced in writing about our cultural attainments. The newspaper reporters seem to feel impelled to pull a wisecrack if possible. And the desk man would rather think up a funny headline than an accurate one. They deceive themselves into thinking that people like this. The truth of the matter is that too many of the newspaper men do not take their own work seriously. They do not take their state seriously. If the Wichita papers, for example, would give more space to the glories of Kansas and less to the iniquities of Topeka, and if the Topeka newspapers would give more space to the cultural activities of the city and less to the political goings-on in the State House, and if all the editors of all the papers would read Kansas Magazine and print excerpts from it instead of lifting paragraphs from the Kansas City Star, we would have an even better state than we have now, and we would have more fun living in it or visiting outside of it. In Harper's Magazine in 1962, Dr. Karl rose to the defense of Kansas once again when he refuted an editorial in Harper's Magazine. One of the wise, thoughtful writers of the country has stumbled. In his September issue, friend John Fisher, editor-in-chief of Harper's, wrote an excellent editorial regarding certain changes in American industrial development, and discussed the intangible assets of certain inspiring sites. He named North Carolina, New England, Puerto Rico, the Northwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, curiously omitting Colorado, and then it happens. Rhetorically, he exclaims, how could anybody create either a great university or an enticing environment in Kansas or North Dakota? This, comments James A. McCain, a former North Carolinian, now president of the State University, in the Journal of the Kansas Industrial Development Commission, reflects a widespread image of this state, although a grossly distorted image. It probably is the image held by the man in the street of Philadelphia, the factory worker in Rhode Island, the lobster fisherman in Maine, and the sharecropper in Alabama, but by one of the most intelligent, educated, and sophisticated men in one of the most metropolitan and broad-minded cities in the world? I think we ought to do something about this. We ought to invite Mr. Fisher and some of his friends to visit us. We should show them our several state and universities, our many excellent colleges, our Lindsborg Festival, an art center, the Eisenhower Library at Abilene, and the William Rockwell Nelson Museum, and the incomparable Linda Hall Library on our front porch. We would like to take Mr. Fisher and his party up a beautiful hill west of Topeka, past lakes and lawns, through groves of trees and meadows of wildflowers, to our clock tower building, a replica of Philadelphia's Independence Hall. They might take a moment to look at the historical museum with the exhibits of medical art and medical history, or the psychiatric archives, or the offices of the education department of the Menninger Foundation. Emerging from the building, they might take a quick look at the sunset reflected on the river to the northwest, or at the city stretching out below to the south and east. Then they might follow some of the invisible threads leading from this center to the state hospitals of Kansas and the state hospitals of 20 other states. They might skip 4 miles south to the handsome VA hospital, long the pilot and leader in this great chain, and on 6 miles to the Forbes Air Force Base Hospital and Psychiatric Center. Or they might follow threads in other directions to a score of clinics and hospitals where psychiatry in a new key is taught, practiced, and utilized, where various research projects inspire hope for the better use of the manpower in these other states, which Mr. Fisher found so much more inspiring. Or we should take Mr. Fisher east on the turnpike through the hills of Shawnee and Douglas to the Mount Oriat Heights, and there give him a look at the most beautiful university campus in the world, with a panorama of buildings set in a panorama of scenery and nurturing an expanding panorama of ideas and cultural development. We are not through with Mr. Fisher yet. We would want to turn him around and take him west to another range of hills edging the beautiful Blue Valley, perhaps soon to be a national park. Here we'd show him the first and the finest agricultural school in the land, now a state university, well deserving that name in spite of Mr. Fisher's derogations about our uninspiring milieu. No skyscrapers, no slums, no dirty streets, no tower bridges, none of the attributes of the Manhattan in which Mr. Fisher lives and from which he sits in judgment. But serenity and dignity, earnestness and dedication, beauty and aspiration, these he would find in Manhattan, Kansas. Then he might drive south to Matfield Green, where even Mr. Fisher might catch his breath in awe of the 100,000-acre stretches of beauty in the famous Flint Hills, before going east to Neodesha and winding through the lovely and famous Sycamore Valley, where more kinds of plants life grow than anywhere else in the U.S., over 1,500 species. From there, Mr. Fisher and his party could drive slowly through various kinds of mining to the metropolitanism of Kansas City, Kansas, or head farther east into the Boston and Ozark Mountains, but wherever he went, I don't think he would forget us. It may be our fault that people like Mr. Fisher remain as ignorant of Kansas in 1962 as our ancestors and his were in 1862. Bleeding Kansas, they called it. Poor, bleeding, boiling, beaten Kansas. Other states boast of their advantages, wrote Kenneth Davis in the New York Times some years ago. Kansas, with a kind of amused chuckle, boasts of her ills. Other states speak loudly of their blessings and softly, or not at all, of their misfortunes. Kansas does, or did, the reverse. She spread abroad tall tales of her anguish, the worst donuts, the worst droughts, the dreariest landscapes, the biggest winds, the smallest potatoes, the most voracious grasshoppers. She displays a masochist's delight in suffering or a tough guy's pride in being able to take it. Consciously or unconsciously, Kansans have encouraged the popular view of their state as 82,000 square miles of monotony so boring and dull as to be in itself a sufficient cause of religious and moral excesses. We ought to remember more often and spread more widely the words of the great Cyrus K. Holliday, written 100 years ago. A more lovely country I certainly never saw, and yet it looks worse now than at any other season. I am told by those I submit in an answer to Mr. Fisher that someone might indeed think of this neighborly, industrious, productive, beautiful, uncrowded state as capable of being a center of learning and of inspiration for the youth, and for the cultivation of scholarship, appreciation of beauty, and the promotion as a mentally healthy vision of the good life.